Welcome to the Social Workers Radio Talk Show, where we'll be having a special segment, Social Work Shorts, which is a brief interview with a guest on an important social work topic. Unlike our live, longer shows, this segment is pre-recorded and will only be about 15 minutes but packed with content. Today we have Susan Klemme. Susan is a UAlbany social work graduate, class of 2005, and has been employed in various clinical and administrative positions with the Office of Mental Health for over 10 years. A majority of her work experience has been in direct, inpatient clinical care and the administrative review of not guilty by reason of mental defect cases, also known as the Insanity Plea. Susan is a suicide loss survivor and endured the death of her friend Kerry, who was also a clinician, in 2011. Since this time, Susan has become an advocate and educator for suicide prevention and has trained college students, law enforcement, and school staff in SafeTALK. Susan is also a board member of the Capital District chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and currently serves as the board secretary. Thank you so much for being here and speaking about such an important topic. As we just were saying before we went on, this is September Suicide Awareness Month, Prevention Month.
One of those.
Suicide. Either way, this month is the day, the month that we focus on suicide.
I think it's Suicide Prevention Month.
Mm-hmm. So I want to start off with a question that's a little specific, but I really want to make sure I have the correct terminology as well. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes people are so terrified to talk about suicide. Mm-hmm. And how do we say it? How do we word things? Mm-hmm. And language can be important, especially if someone has lost a relative or a friend to suicide. We want to make sure that we're saying what's appropriate, I guess the words would be.
Right.
So how important is language, and what is some of the more appropriate, I should say, language that we should be using?
When talking to both suicide survivors of a suicide loss, or those who have attempted, or even when doing prevention or education, language is pretty important. Historically, we always say commit suicide, and commit has a lot of negative connotations. For example, you commit a sin, you commit adultery, you commit a crime, or even, in the mental health world, when we talk about involuntary commitment, that pretty much means you have been placed in a psychiatric center against your will. So there really is no positive connotations to the word commit. So, the language has changed, kind of like the language with other things have changed through the years. Like, we don't call the refrigerator the icebox anymore. We don't call the couch the Davenport, We've brought things up to speed. And when we talk about a suicide death or a suicide loss, you can say both of those things. Like, I understand you've had a suicide loss. I understand you've had a suicide death in your family. When you describe someone having died by suicide, you can say exactly that. They died by suicide. They ended their life. They killed themselves. And part of what I teach in regards to SafeTALK is about having open and honest dialogue about suicide, because that's how we bring attention to the cause and how we truly educate people in prevention efforts.
I mean, it's really great to know just that it's okay to talk about. Sometimes it's one of the topics that people just kind of want to avoid or not talk about.
Oh, right. It's a hot topic for sure. I mean, even talking about mortality when someone dies of a natural cause, say cancer or old age, people are uncomfortable about it. But when you talk about someone taking their own life, that's an extra level of uncomfortability that most people just, try to shy away from.
And how is it for family members? Let's say if a loved one had died by suicide. Is there resources for them to talk about it and how to become comfort? I don't think there's ever comfort, but to be able to sort of say that, a loved one died by suicide, whereas it might be something that they're not sure how to even mention to other people.
Right, and I've seen it go both ways. For example, when my friend Kerry died, her family was very open about it. Her obituary said, she died at home and that donations in her name could be made to the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention. They didn't try to hide it whatsoever. And then other times, just because this is like my field and I'm looking at obituaries and I've kind of come to read the codes that are in the obituaries. Like you'll see died at home, died alone, and that tells me what's going on. But families have a really hard time talking about it because it's, there's a lot of shame associated with ending your life. We assume that only certain kinds of people die by suicide, and we think crazy people, which crazy is in of itself very dismissive, or they think like, oh, they were mentally ill, or oh, they must have been abused. It really brings a lot onto the family versus if you said so-and-so's child died of cancer, next thing you know, their front lawn would be plastered with cancer support posters and casseroles, but suicide is a really hush-hush situation. And even in the course of my own loss, when it happened, I did not, aside from the people who knew me and knew what had happened to me, I did not tell anyone because here I was, it affected me both personally and professionally. Personally, I lost my friend. I couldn't save my friend. Professionally, you're a social worker and you didn't know your friend was suicidal and she died. Like, I couldn't tell anyone at work. I hid it for a really long time until I realized, like, why am I doing this? It's not a service to me. It's not a service to my friend. And I was fortunate enough to get to that place where I wasn't ashamed of it. Not everybody gets there, but, now that I'm here, I'm not going back, so.
Well, I think what you're doing right now and going out and talking about it, telling people that it's okay to talk about it, I think that's a real help. But sometimes people really aren't sure what to do or how to address it or what to say. Do I say anything? Do it something that we just keep it within our family? There's so many different ways that people can respond. Having you talk about and saying, this is okay to talk about. This is ways to talk about it. This is ways to bring it, to talk to someone who might be struggling to talk about it.
Right.
Those are all things that are really helpful.
And I certainly wouldn't be in this place if I hadn't linked up with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. My friend Kerry died in March of 2011. In September 2011, I went to my first Walk for Rita, which is held in Saratoga. And I got there and I realized here there are like 2,000-3,000 people that have experienced the same thing I did. And that feeling of being alone was gone, and it was so therapeutic. And I think being open and honest and knowing there is a community of support out there was huge for me. It really was. It was like I found my family. So.
And you just said about 2,000-3,000 people just here in Saratoga for that.
Yeah.
And this is a health epidemic that does not discriminate, and you had mentioned that before we went on. Can you provide some information about sort of the numbers? Are the rates of suicide going up? What's happening?
They have gone up a little bit. In the past few years, they've gone up about 2%. Basically, what that means is we were on average from maybe around 115 people dying by suicide a day to maybe like around 118, 119. We know from those numbers that 22 of those are veterans. We also know that other groups have more statistical significance in regards to suicide death. Men over age 50, it's the second leading cause of death amongst college students. And then we're also seeing a lot of the baby boomer generation who might have been ill-prepared in a number of ways to kind of face the aging process are also there. But something that's important to consider and that I talk about in SafeTALK is that, so we know what the numbers tell us. This kind of group, these kinds of group, people with this kind of diagnosis, da-da-da-da. And so, SafeTALK cautions us, though, if we pay attention only to the groups we know that are statistically significant, we are ignoring a whole bunch of other individuals that maybe, are 0.01%, but still 0.01% is still somebody's child, neighbor, mother, etc. So in SafeTALK, one of the points I drive home is that anybody can be at risk, regardless of what we hear in the news or, again, glean from statistical information.
No, just to clarify, can you just let everyone know what SafeTALK is? Because some people might not be familiar.
SafeTALK, I'm a trainer in SafeTALK. I took training in SafeTALK after my friend Kerry passed. I had to do it for work. It wasn't something that I sought out. And then once I actually used it and saw that it worked and realized I could do this to prevent other suicide deaths, I became a trainer for it. So I'm not endorsing a product I don't believe in, but SafeTALK is a Canadian training program. It's probably about 10 years old at this point, but basically it's about open, honest dialogue about SafeTALK, and it provides you with a model to do an initial intervention. Basically being able to recognize perhaps what kinds of things are going on in someone's life that might indicate they're having thoughts of suicide, being able to ask them directly, being able to listen, and then being able to keep them safe, hooking them up with a keep safe connection, which in some circumstances could be a hospital or the police, etc. It's not the intervention per se, but it's more of a gatekeeper training. It's putting people in the world with their eyes and ears suicide alert, which is definitely necessary.
Okay. And you said you've been trained since for how long? Doing the trainings?
Oh, I can't remember. 3-4 years.
Now, do you, when you're giving the trainings, do people that you're training, do they have myths in their head about suicide or certain beliefs that they might have that you're like, no, that's not?
Right. There's some pretty common myths about suicide. I think the most common one is if you talk to someone who might be going through some things or struggling, that if you ask them about suicide or you talk about suicide, that you're going to plant the idea in their head. People are terrified of that, especially when it comes to children. And the reality is you really can't plant anything in anyone's head. If I said to you, hey, give me your wallet, you're going to say, hey, that's a good idea? No. You're not, people just are not that susceptible to being planted with an idea. So that's one of the myths. I'm trying to, again, only certain kinds of people die from suicide, people with a psychiatric illness, people who have problems, things like that. So we talk about all of those things.
Well, I think clearing up the myths, too, is important, especially for an individual who has lost someone to suicide. So I think clearing that up can help provide some relief, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word, but help people feel like, hey, that's not true. That's not a accurate statement. It's something that I shouldn't have. It happens to other people. It happens to people without psychiatric diagnosis.
And certainly, combating the myths also takes away some of that hesitation about asking directly. So if you ask someone directly about suicide, that it's not going to plant the idea in their head, you're going to be more apt to do it. The same thing with a child. Like, I think there's someone, I don't know, I might plant the idea in the mind of a child. No, that's not going to happen. So maybe that will get rid of that barrier to you asking a child.
So if somebody does feel that somebody might be at a risk, what should they ask? Like, how do you even start that conversation? If you're with an individual, should you just ask if they have a plan? Should you come out and say it? Or what should somebody do if you feel like a friend or a family member, you're concerned?
Well, SafeTALK, the model, the T in the word talk stands for tells. And tells are things that we might learn, see, observe, know, etc. about a person that might lead us to believe that suicide is involved. So, for example, you're pretty much looking for something that's different or something that's a change. So, for example, if someone typically is very well-dressed and well put together and pays a lot of attention to their appearance, and you see a decline in that, and then maybe combined with, like, they keep showing up to class late, and maybe you see them at the bar a lot, these are going to be those little tells that are going to lead you to believe that something is up. There's a change there. And then again, say, for example, you've seen this person crying, or maybe they've been saying, like, I feel useless, I feel hopeless. Sometimes it's not always that obvious, but again, you're looking for a change, something that's different. And so when you notice those changes, you use that as a part of your asking. You don't just ask someone out of the blue, like someone you meet on the street, like, hi, how are you? Are you thinking of suicide? You're going to want to go in there with what you learn about that person to kind of bolster your case. Like, so for example, Jim, I noticed you've been late to work lately and you seem kind of disheveled and really tired. Is there something going on with you? And perhaps Jim would say, well, my wife and I are having a lot of problems and we're struggling with money. And then you might go back to him and say, okay, so you're struggling with money and the relationship's not going well, combined with those other things I've observed about you. are you having thoughts of suicide? So when you present it in a way that lets people know that you've noticed and you care enough to notice, that usually results in a more honest answer. In addition, it's kind of hard when we're confronted perhaps with facts or observations to say no, right? So that typically leads to, as I said, a more honest answer.
And it's okay to, like you said, that's one of the myths, that if you ask, they might plant the idea, and we know that it's okay to ask. It's okay to ask directly.
Right.
Are you having these thoughts?
Right, and there's absolutely no harm in asking. If you ask someone, Jim, I've noticed this, this, and this, and are you having thoughts of suicide? And Jim says, no, I'm not, but, I'm really struggling with these other things. It caused him no harm. There was no harm done whatsoever. I mean, there is the chance that perhaps Jim in this case could be like, ugh, like maybe he'd find it offensive that you asked about suicide. Like, I would never do something like that. But, you have to do a little cost-benefit analysis and say, okay, what's the cost? Jim could die, and I didn't ask him directly about it. And, what could or he could be mad at me. I don't know. To me, I think about what could I live with longer, right? How could I go to sleep at night? If I had asked him and he was mad, or I didn't ask him and it's still hovering out there. So
what are some things that we can do to help with suicide prevention? The average person, what are some things we can do?
As I said, it's about open and honest dialogue. I think it would help to kind of stop pretending that it really is a pretty significant issue. As I said, well over 100 people die every day. So if I said to you, oh, by the way, every day a commercial airline crashes in the United States, you'd probably be outraged, wouldn't you? Like, what is the FAA doing? But we don't feel that way about suicide. I mean, more people die from suicide than homicide, car crashes, etc. And it's kind of like this hidden epidemic. So I think, again, just bringing attention to the cause. There's a lot of research going on in regards to suicide through the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. We do a lot of fundraising to kind of sponsor the research. Again, attending a training, being able to recognize the signs and symptoms. And I think, even at the most basic level, it's the language piece. Maybe knowing what to say or what to not say to someone who's had a suicide loss, even small steps like that. So,
are there any resources you want to provide our listeners where they could go to find out more information, or any?
Sure. Well, as I said, personally, for me, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention really did a lot. And here in the Capital Region, we have a really big Capital Region chapter. I'm on the board. I'm the board secretary. We do a lot of community walks, which is where I said, that's where lost survivors can get together, and we're just all together, and it's all out there. Nobody needs to be ashamed. We all know we're here. So it's a very cathartic event, but we also do a lot of fundraising, which, as I said, goes to research. But those same funds also go into paying for public education. For example, we paid for buses so students could go to mental health lobby day, all kinds of stuff. But also what we do is we do a lot of work with lost survivors. And two things we do, we have several different support groups in the Capital District that people can just go to anonymously and just, again, be around other people who've had the same kind of loss. In addition, we also have a suicide loss outreach program. So say, hypothetically speaking, you lost a parent to suicide. You could ask for an outreach visit, and they will match you with a person who's been trained in outreach, who's had a similar loss, also lost a parent. And they can come to your house and talk to you, or talk to you on the phone, or email you, because it is a different kind of loss, and that person might not have anyone in their lives that they can really be honest about, this is how my mom died. And just being able to interact with someone who understands that is the power of that is just really unparalleled.
Well, I just want to thank you. We're not going to wrap up because we're out of time, but I just want to thank you for coming and talking about this, because more we all know about suicide, but to actually have conversations about it and feel comfortable talking about it. Because, you're right, I've been around a lot of people who don't want to mention it. Even when we had a fellow peer that I knew had died by suicide, and no one really was talking about it. It was never like addressed directly. It was like he died, but there wasn't that conversation. I think people wanted it, but no one knew how to bring it up. No one wanted to be the first one to say it. They were waiting for someone else to say it, and we never really addressed it together as a group. And I think the more openly we can talk about it, the better it is for not only for prevention, but for the people who are trying to deal with everything and deal with the emotions, to be able to talk about it openly and say, okay, this is what happened, and here we can go through this together. We can process this together. So I think the work that you're doing is amazing, and I want to thank you for that. And you are a great resource. And at the Office of Mental Health, is there resources there for individuals?
There are. They have a suicide prevention office. I work specifically for the Capital District Psychiatric Center, so I'm not sure. I know OMH has like a statewide initiative and things of that nature, but mine is more at the grassroots local level. So.
All right. Well, I just want to thank you again for coming on today and sharing this important knowledge.